Thank you everyone for joining us. This is AI and Human Rights, the future of AI policy in the United States. I'm Eleni Kyriakides with the Electronic Privacy Information Center. We're the ones putting on this event. We're an NGO based here in DC. And with that, thank you. And I'd like to welcome to the stage Rush Holt, the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Thank you. It's great to see you all here. And it's great that the EPIC folks are doing this session. It's certainly timely. Most of you, I'm guessing, are deep into this subject. So as a result, I won't go into great detail. I may need my notes, though. Yes. Because the panel is just a terrific panel. But I wanted to say a few general remarks, starting with congratulations to EPIC for 25 really effective years working in a number of different areas. I think the name or the acronym, maybe it is EPIC, maybe that is a good acronym, but the name doesn't begin to tell you all that EPIC does. And it's more than an information center. It is a legal powerhouse that is doing a great deal to see that privacy, human rights, and other values are protected in a variety of ways. It's really led the way on emerging privacy and civil liberties issues, and now artificial intelligence. In 2014, EPIC launched the campaign for algorithmic transparency. I hope the name is transparent enough, the title of that undertaking. But it is to see that more than transparency is enforced with respect to AI, accountability as well. AI, well, it's hard to be transparent, actually, with AI, because even if you're using open source software, the way that software modifies itself in the AI work is hard to predict. And so I think that EPIC will be looking not just at transparency, but accountability in a post-use sense as well. Just as in pharmaceuticals, it's not enough to say that this has been approved for general use. We have to see how it actually works. And AAAS, my organization, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, of which I am the CEO and executive publisher, and EPIC are working together now to open US AI policy to the public. There's a petition joined by a number of leading scientific organizations that include ACM, and IEEE, and nearly 100 experts have called for public input for US artificial intelligence policy. We recognize, all of us involved, but certainly I can speak for the AAAS, we understand that AI holds tremendous promise for social good and carries tremendous risks. And ethical science that safeguards human rights is a long-standing project of the scientific community. AAAS, the world's largest general science and engineering organization, has been a leader in the application of human rights to science and the application of science to human rights. And responsible science should be based on robust collaboration between the larger society and the scientific community. And the development of AI policy not only is no exception to that, it's a particularly strong case where the collaboration between scientists and society at large is essential. Both scientific and human rights expertise in Congress and among federal employees, I think will be particularly important for crafting an effective AI policy. You know, often in science and engineering, and I think particularly in the case of AI, technical complexity, whether deliberately or incidentally, is used to exclude non-scientists, the non-experts, even the experts who aren't expert in that particular science or engineering field. It's a constant battle to work against that, to get the engineers and scientists to relate to others and to make sure that the regulations and procedures don't exclude the very people whose input is necessary to see that rights are protected. EPIC and the Public Voice Coalition released the Universal Guidelines for Artificial Intelligence last year, and over 250 experts and 60 organizations representing more than 40 countries have endorsed those guidelines. I expect we will be hearing more about that, as I expect we will be hearing more about the OECD guidelines and principles. And the 12 guidelines that I was referring to are intended to maximize the benefits of AI, to minimize the risk, and to ensure the protection of human rights. We believe, these 12 principles should be the baseline for AI policymaking here. One of the things that the guidelines specifically prohibit would be unitary scoring of citizens, a scary thought that indeed is happening in the world, and if we're not careful, it might happen here. There's so many things in recent years that we've said, oh, it can't happen here, only to find out that it can. Initially, when the White House looked at this, at AI, it seemed to me it went like this: AI, go for it. But because societies and watchdog organizations like EPIC have gotten involved, I think they are much more circumspect in the policymaking, and that certainly is good. The United States historically has championed human rights and the rule of law around the world, at least as we espouse it. Let's hope in the AI practice we actually walk the walk. Now, there are a couple of problems, I think, with AI, and forgive me if this is too simplistic, but as I said earlier, the very complexity of it is sometimes used as a shield, whether deliberately or unintentionally. But also, there is this sense that people are, I guess, peddling, that the old adage, garbage in, garbage out, doesn't apply to this kind of computing. In fact, I think it does apply to this kind of computing, only more so, because it has all the usual problems that normal computing could have, but also it can concentrate or distill the garbage that goes in and make that an even larger part of the output. Or worse, it can even grow from a small seed of garbage as the AI thinks about how it should be working to actually exaggerate the garbage in. So AI deserves real attention. And I draw your attention to the report of the UN Special Rapporteur, David Kaye, who said that general statements of ethics with respect to AI should not serve as a cover for companies or public authorities to neglect binding and enforceable human rights based regulation. A very good report from the Special Rapporteur. And I think I recommend it to you. I think he raises quite well the problems of freedom of expression, right to privacy, and non-discrimination associated with AI. I'm sure we will hear a lot about all of those things today. We have an excellent panel, an excellent moderator, and it looks to me like an excellent audience. Thanks.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. And thanks to the National Press Club for hosting us, and thanks for EPIC for putting this important panel on. We have a terrific group of panelists today, left to right, Sherry Turkle, Lynn Parker, Sarah Box, Liana Petkova, and Lorraine Kisselberg. I'm going to have something to say about each of them when it comes time for them to speak. But just to introduce myself first, I'm Harry Lewis. I've been teaching computer science at Harvard since 1974. I have a very odd distinction in life of having taught both Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg immediately before they dropped out of college, either because I taught them everything they needed to know or because I persuaded them that everything I had to say was pointless and they were better off going off by themselves. But whichever way, I became involved with EPIC's important work, I suppose in part out of concern for the world that students like these have given us. So the subject of our panel today is AI policy. As the announcement says, the rise of AI has already begun to challenge fundamental rights of fairness, accountability, and transparency. AI by the public and private sector can mean real-life consequences for people in employment, housing, credit, commerce, and criminal sentencing. At the same time, AI promises economic and social prosperity across many fields. How should the U.S. address human rights challenges of AI domestically and abroad? What should the U.S. role in AI be on the international stage? Around what principles for AI has the U.S. policymaking begun to converge? So those are the kinds of questions that our panel will address. I just want to say a few words, very few words, to set the stage myself, and then we'll move on. I recently came across a wonderful reminder that in the beginning, AI was supposed to be our friend. The earliest reference to AI of which I'm aware is from about 800 BC. Homer, in the Iliad, describing the divine blacksmith Hephaestus, says that he, quote, took up a heavy stick in his hand and went to the doorway limping, and in support of their master moved his attendants. These are golden and in appearance like living young women. There is intelligence in their hearts, and there is speech in them, and strength. And from the immortal gods, they've learned how to do things. These stirred nimbly in support of their master. So there we are, assistive robotics, speech synthesis, learning, all of the hot topics in contemporary AI. But the point of reading this is that we were supposed to be in charge of our machines. Surely that is true, generally, sometimes at least today, but it's not clear that it's turning out to be that way in general. The machines are being put in charge of us. Think of the gig workers whose time slices are being auctioned off by algorithms, or the surveillance applications such as face recognition, or the criminal sentencing software that is trained on data from decades of biased human decisions. So to be more precise, in each of these cases, a small number of humans are creating and using AI to surveil, control, or sentence the many. So while the prospects for the beneficial uses of AI are boundless, the human rights issues are very serious. So I'm now going to begin by asking each of our panelists to tell us where they see the most important risks and opportunities in AI today. So that's the first question. That's going to be kind of a lightning round. I've given them each 2 minutes. Just where do they see the risks and opportunities in AI? After that, we'll make a second pass through the group, asking them to talk about their own work as it relates to AI policy, because we have a series of experts here from whom we want to hear about that. And then I'll moderate, saying as little as possible myself and hoping that the panelists will talk to each other. And I'll moderate the discussion. And then at about 20 minutes of 3, which I don't see a clock anywhere. I'll have to figure that out with my old analog wristwatch. We'll open it up to the audience and we'll have time for discussion with the group. So I'm now going to sit down and get myself mic'd up so that I'm no longer. The leader, but merely the moderator. So I'd like to turn first to Sherry Turkle, Professor Sherry Turkle of MIT. Sherry is a psychologist and sociologist who's been studying the social and psychological effects of digital technology for over 40 years. What does computer technology not just do for us, but to us as people? How does it affect our relationships with other people and with ourselves? So, for example, Sherry's earliest work on artificial intelligence tracked how it gave people a new view of self that stressed mechanism over meaning. Or, as she put it at the time, when children play with computer toys, they don't just ask if these machines that seem almost alive think like people, but whether people might always have thought like machines. So, Sherry, what would you say are the most important risks and opportunities in AI?
Well, in my lightning round, what I've decided to talk about is the fact that artificial intelligence has moved from not just being about artificial intelligence, but to being about artificial intimacy. So AI now, in my world at MIT, doesn't just stand for machines that are artificially intelligent, but actually are trying to be artificially intimate with you. We now present people with objects that don't just say they're smart, but say, I love you, I care, let's be friends, how's your mother? I've heard your mother isn't well, let's talk. Really that to both children and elders and as therapists and as companions, really go for the intimacy button. And they offer pretend empathy. And it turns out, and this has been something that I've been studying really for decades, that people are what I call cheap dates in this area. When a machine says it cares, people tend to think that they are cared for. And this is our human vulnerability. We can sort of do nothing about this. This is deeply baked into it. I call it pushing our Darwinian buttons. What are our Darwinian buttons? Our Darwinian buttons is that when an object, when an entity looks us in the eyes, recognizes us by name, gestures with affection, we are basically emotional toast. And we have to kind of work with this because this is sort of, you know, evolution creating us as empathy machines. But the issue now is the exploitation of our vulnerability because we don't have machines that are capable of caring relationships, or we don't have machines that would even know what caring could mean. What they're able to do is simulate caring and kind of do a pretend empathy. And then the question is, what are the human costs of being exposed from the earliest ages to pretend empathy? Now, I'm concerned about children, elders, and these machines being offered as psychotherapists and companions, and I propose that artificial intelligence creatures should only be able, I'm not against artificial intelligence, I'm against kind of false promises. I propose that artificial intelligence creatures should only be able to promise what they can deliver. And I think that this is a human rights issue because simulated thinking may be thinking, but simulated feeling is not feeling, simulated love is never love, and the risk is that we define down human uniqueness. The human experience is that we have a chance to redefine what is important in being human. Now, what is that? It's our human lives, our human relationships, our human loves, and our human losses. Another risk is philosophical. AI has always shaped a worldview with a distinctive aesthetic. Here's the aesthetic. The difficult will be made easy, the rough will become smooth, that which had friction will become friction-free. The vision even has its sights on social friction, the hard bits of political organizing, and even the personal interactions that might cause emotional stress. That's why everybody wants a sex robot, a love robot, a babysitter robot. The idea is to take the stress out of human interactions. In due course, we all got used to texting rather than talking, and email rather than conversation, and real time became everybody's enemy because taking life out of real time meant a life with less vulnerability. And everybody wanted that. Everybody seemed to want less friction. Now, if our companions are AI robots, we don't need to do the hard work of dealing with each other. So people who push, and these are my colleagues who push for AI psychotherapists, are always saying how much more relaxing it is for people to talk to a machine as a psychotherapist. Relaxing, but without human meaning. So in conclusion, our opportunity is to assert that we are not the intelligences that we have created. We are creatures of history, of deep psychology, of complex relationships that are intrinsically generators of friction as they are worked out. Friction means being vulnerable, putting yourself in the place of another person with all the conflict that that brings. That's the opportunity. And it's time, I think, to associate the digital with new values, the values of friction rather than not friction, remembering that the opposite of easy is not just difficult. The opposite of easy is also evoked by words such as complex, involved, and demandings. And I think those are the skills that we're going to need as we look up from our phones. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's
we could take the whole hour just on that. But I'm going to move on to introduce Dr. Lynn Parker, who leads the White House's efforts on artificial intelligence. She's a strong believer in the power of AI to help treat illness, grow our food, manufacture and deliver new products, improve our transportation systems, and deliver other positive benefits. Her goal is to help the nation experience these beneficial outcomes by promoting the responsible stewardship and adoption of trustworthy AI. So, Lynn, thank you.
So good afternoon. I think certainly from the perspective of the benefits versus the risk, we want to be sure that we're not looking at AI as all the same. There are many, many, many types of AI. And you can think of AI as a companion, and I agree with that, but in more practical current applications, AI is a tool. And so if you think about AI as a tool, AI can be used to do things like improve our manufacturing processes and make them more efficient. It could be used to help our transportation systems be more efficient and more safe. It could help us understand how to diagnose and treat diseases. It could provide us with opportunities to have personalized learning opportunities that are tailored to our own capabilities and needs. It could help us with weather forecasting and help us to be more proactive in looking at what might be coming from a weather perspective. It can help us to be able to monitor endangered marine life along coastlines. And so there are a wide variety of applications of AI that are more like tools, and they are very beneficial in many ways. I think, again, the risk is that we treat all AI the same and have some of the same maybe oversight of all AI where it's not particularly needed in many use cases of AI. And so I think we do need to have that level of nuance when we have conversations about AI, that we recognize that it's not just AI and it has all of these characteristics, but certain use cases of AI have certain characteristics that we need to dig into more deeply and oversee more deeply. So I think right now, if you look at a lot of the applications of AI that are really the cause, I think, for a lot of the buzz today, a lot of these current applications are due to the recent success of deep machine learning. Some of the risks of those applications of deep machine learning are because it's still a black box, and we don't fully understand how the technology works inside that neural net. We're working on research to help us understand that, to help us have techniques to be able to allow us to understand, to be able to interpret what's happening in that deep neural net. But until we've progressed the science and the technology to that point, we do need to make sure that we oversee those particular use cases where it could cause harm to individuals. And so I think it's important for us to consider each case individually. It's not that all AI has the same challenges. The danger, of course, of treating all of AI the same is that we squash the positive and beneficial uses of AI because we're treating it all in an overbearing kind of governance approach. And so I think those are the areas that we need to be very thoughtful. We need to be very engaging in what the technology really can do. We also need to approach our oversight of AI with an evidence-based approach, where we're treating this based on scientific evidence of what actually is happening, a scientific understanding of what the AI actually is doing, and then addressing that problem, not addressing a concern that might happen down the road, but in fact hasn't happened. We can be proactive in considering those areas, but trying to make sure that we're all along considering the evidence and the technical studies that show us exactly what the AI really is doing, and to do the R&D in order to help us with those kinds of tools.
Thank you. So next up is Sarah Box. Sarah Box has been with the Science, Technology, and Innovation Directorate of the OECD, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, since 2007. As counselor to the Science, Technology, and Innovation Directorate, she has the pleasure and privilege of poking her nose into the full span of issues tackled by the Directorate, from innovation ecosystems to shipbuilding and everything in between. A particular focus right now is work on digital transformation, and her directorate is responsible for the OECD's recent recommendation on artificial intelligence, as well as a forthcoming report on AI in society. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Harry. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I just wanted to say that EPIC is such a valuable voice in the civil society group that comes and sits at the table at our Committee for Digital Economy Policy at the OECD. They're a really strong advocate for civil liberties, privacy, and human rights. So it's a pleasure to be able to come and contribute to your conversation today. Look, I think the opportunities of AI are many, and I think I'm in Lynn's camp here. I think what it does at its core is it improves the quality of our predictions and our decision making. And let's face it, those are things that we do every day as humans, all the time. There's a lot of excellent uses in terms of saving lives. So Lynn, you mentioned some of the medical things, but there's wearable devices that can use your heart rate to detect diabetes. You've got, again, wearable devices that can help the elderly stay at home because it detects their falls or near falls. You've got AI being used to help medical practitioners read scans looking for lung cancer and having a much greater success rate in detecting that. You've got AI being used for disaster relief efforts, detecting illegal logging and poaching, helping out with transportation systems, energy management, all of those things, right through to the more mundane items of helping me choose what I'm going to read next on my Kindle. But of course, like every technology, there are risks, and it's no surprise. And I think in terms of the conversation today about human rights, I would point to two clusters of risks. The first would be around AI itself and the possibility of either reinforcing or introducing new bias or new forms of discrimination. When we're using data that already exists, it's ingraining people's existing values and beliefs. We may be perpetuating bias and inequalities that have been here for some time. The second cluster of risk that I would point out comes from the development of AI and the power structures that it sets up. So questions we can ask, well, who does own the data? Who has the ecosystem that's able to develop AI? Who has the AI capabilities? And if we see concentration, and you can think about this at a number of different levels, you can think about it at the geographic level, you can think about at a sectoral level between the private and public sectors. You can also think about it in terms of businesses, large and small. But if you see that kind of concentration, are we actually going to reduce the diversity that we see in AI systems? Are we going to be fully reflecting the different cultures and different values that we have across the world? And will we actually have AI for good? Now, I do think that we are in control. We have the opportunity to shape AI and the systems and the frameworks around it. I think that we can ensure that human rights can be respected, that we can ensure safety, that we can demand transparency and overt use of AI. In my view, I think we're in a transition period right now, and I think we have a window to act and to try and instill trust in this technology.
Thank you. Before I move on, since both Lynn and Sarah mentioned the biomedical uses, and I gave a fairly dark introduction here. I do want to say I'm fully supportive of this. This thing that looks like a second microphone is actually an insulin pump, which supposedly has learned all about me, and I can tell you is dumber than any pancreas in this room, unless there's another type 1 diabetic in the audience. So there's plenty of room and opportunity here for improved medical technology in particular. Now let me turn to Biljana Petkova. Biljana teaches law at the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands. For this semester, she's been the visiting professor at Georgetown Law, where she co-taught with Mark Rotenberg, seminar on the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. Biljana's publications on law and technology have appeared in both European and American law reviews. Biljana's just started working on a book project under contract with NYU Press titled Privacy in the City, How Data Shapes City Identities.
Great. Well, thanks, Harry. It's certainly a pleasure to be here among so many distinguished speakers, and I am still myself learning a lot about the topic. So, as academics, we're scrambling to find references to the origins of AI, and usually we look into the work of Isaac Asimov, science fiction books. So I really enjoyed your reference to Homer. So it goes way, way back, the idea of AI. I'm just going to start off by saying that from an idea, obviously AI is a reality today. It's the world that we're living in. And so it presents a lot of incredible opportunities for increased efficiency and well-being that my co-panelists pointed out to, and I fully agree with that. But there are also, of course, some challenges connected to every new technology. And I just wanted to pick up the three that, from a human rights perspective, I consider to be the most risky ones. So the first one is facial recognition. And I believe that this connects to the chilling effect on freedom of expression that facial recognition used for mass surveillance can have. So that can also impact on association rights. The second one, I believe, is the possibility of AI-powered system to interfere in elections. And this goes to the very core of our democratic societies. Last but not least, also mentioned by our keynote speaker, unitary credit score systems. And I think that that goes into the very heart of human dignity. So EPIC's doing incredible work on all these fronts, and I think that these are some of the issues that we should think about as challenges as we go ahead as Western democracies.
Thank you. And then finally, let me turn to Lorraine Kisselberg. Lorraine has been both a practitioner and an academic, a former professor of media technology and society. She studies privacy and ethics in emerging technology contexts, and her research has been funded by the NSF. She's currently a visiting faculty fellow at the Center for Research on Information Security at Purdue University. Was a scholar in residence here at EPIC last fall, where she helped to develop the universal guidelines for AI. She recently served on the ACM's Code of Ethics Task Force, that's the Association for Computing Machinery, and she, in fact, has just been named the inaugural chair of the new Global Technology Policy Council for ACM, so congratulations for that. Lorraine.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. And I join the rest of the panel in thanking EPIC for inviting me to be a part of this conversation and the opportunity to discuss some of these issues. I want to directly answer Harry's question about what are the risks and the opportunities that I see in AI. And I'm going to start first from the point of saying that I am a bionic woman. And for all of my life, I've benefited from intelligent technology. I was using wearable technologies before it was even a phrase. I'm now using implanted technologies and have a very highly sophisticated speech recognition computer implanted in my brain. So I also have friends who have benefited from early diagnosis of cancer using fantastic AI-based imaging technology. I have sons who drive more safely on the road because they're using navigation systems that allow them to avoid traffic mishaps. I have robotic vacuums. I have things that make my life better. But the point is not, my argument here, my point of standing here, is not whether AI is good or bad and a binary end there. And we know that there are many good uses of AI. We do know that there are many risks associated with that. But my starting point is what I think is one of the greatest risks that we need to think about right now when we're talking about policy is a failure of imagination. And by that, what I mean is not being able to imagine what the risk might be beyond what we already know. When we focus on privacy implication, we know some of the risk about data protection, about overt and overuses of too much data, about surveillance practices and so forth. So we're comfortable with these kinds of risks and trying to formulate them and encode them in particular policy guidelines. We're not as comfortable with what AI may be in the future and therefore what may the risk may be, whether it's at the emotional level of relational risk, whether it's at the safety and risk level of tools that aren't appropriately designed, or whether it's, again, one of the best examples is algorithmic bias, which everyone is noting now, that really was a failure to anticipate the algorithms could be encoded with the same kinds of biases that human beings have. And so I think that is one of our greatest risks. I'll mention some of the panel members have already mentioned some of those, but I'll mention one that I think is not well discussed yet, and that has to do with the degree of human agency and autonomy or control that we have in autonomic systems that are being developed, whether they are vehicles or whether they are aircraft control systems, whether they are other kinds of things that either support us or perhaps have such a degree of autonomy that they replace what we're doing. I think those risks that are inherent in the lack of human agency and autonomy in these kinds of systems is something that we need to talk about more. And it's something that I hope to talk about a little bit more when we get our next round. So thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so now we've identified a good range of problems and opportunities. Now I'm going to go back through the panel and ask each to comment specifically about how her own work bears on problems of AI policy. So Sherry, would you like to begin?
Yeah, on the question of how my work affects policy, I think, first of all, about my work on how it's time to think about what I call the intended consequences of technology. And here's what I mean by that. For years, I wrote about technology's unintended consequences. That was kind of the framework that I wrote in. As in, and here I'm quoting something I wrote, mobile phones, and you see the passive construction, mobile phones lead to fixation of attention. No. I wrote it, but really that sentence is profoundly misleading. No, those phones are designed to keep you at that phone. The unintended consequence narrative does not fit the known facts. We introduce technology with consequences that we can see straight off, whose consequences are intended. We knowingly put in place artificial intelligence that will spy on us, use our lives as data for the profit of corporations, political parties, governments, anyone really that can profit from what we say, see, or watch online. We knowingly put in place computer counselors in the role of psychotherapists to simulate the feeling of human understanding when there is none, and they do surveillance on the side to babies and children. Making this step from seeing technology's effects as unintended to intended wakes us up to new responsibilities, because we have to ask not just how does technology impact society, and deal with the much harder question, which is always adjacent to it, but which is much more difficult to ask, which is how does society impact technology? In the case of AI, technology is animated by money and power, by social values and social blindness. Once you look for it, you see society and technology everywhere. Some of my panelists have already made reference to this. If a program to decide who gets a mortgage sees mostly white faces, because mostly white faces have received mortgages in the past, the program will be more likely to say that white faces should get mortgages. Society and technology. If more white people get bail, a program that's trained in that culture will suggest bail for white people. I mean, that's not a problem of AI. That's a problem that I'm calling society and technology, which is something that we need to look at as our way of developing technology, developing this AI technology. These examples have become well known, fortunately. So I'm not saying something that's new to this audience. What may be new to you is that when I raise these questions in my teaching and in my interviewing, my students most often respond, "The horse is out of the barn." So first, like, what horse, what barn? In other words, something has been engaged, something has been entrained, something is on the road that is too late to somehow undo, the AI is on its way. Something that, and I teach at MIT, can you imagine what's going on if this horse is out of the MIT barn? Can you imagine what's going on with this horse other places? That this horse is out of the barn. And I said, where have you heard that? And they say their professors say that there's something too late about dealing with this society in technology problem. So I think that answer isn't, which I bring to you with humility, I think it's an abdication of responsibility. I don't think I'm the only one who's hearing the horses out of the barn in conversations about technology. I think it's an abdication of responsibility. I think all of us need to understand a new kind of digitally sophisticated sociology of knowledge as a human rights issue. People need to understand how social relationships become embodied in code, and then to confront the injustices, and I think you brought this up very eloquently, that are now getting baked into technology where they become invisible and where they become the new normal. There is, of course, a positive side to how AI embodies the real. It means that AI, if examined critically, is a window, a new window onto the real world. It shows us every day that we have to work on the real world as hard as we work on our technology. We can't just work on our technology and hope it fixes the real world. And yet I see every day that hope that somehow technology will fix what technology has broken. So in the policy area, we need the wisdom to know when to sideline AI and say with human humility that only human intelligence can help us, that only human intelligence will do. And this is so hard because I have colleagues who have done path-breaking research and discovered, for example, an empathy gap when young people use mobile phones. This is that the more they use their phones, the less empathy they have. And then, understandably depressed, my colleagues, these same researchers, turned their amazing talents to developing empathy apps for the iPhone. It's really not to laugh because we all have this desire that technology should fix what technology has broken. It's really what we all want. But I'm pitching that to fix what is most urgently broken right now, we don't need smoother apps. We need the rough and tumble of talking to each other. I'm pitching that we humans are the empathy app and that AI can help us understand that. I'm pitching that people in conversation with each other, being vulnerable to each other, are the empathy app, and that right now we need empathy more than ever. We need to fight against the coarsening of our lives politically and personally, and there are so many wonderful things for AI to do, and there are sacred spaces where we do it most justice to simply say that it does not belong. There are so many sacred spaces where we do AI the most respect to have the human wisdom to just leave it out of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, policy.
Lynn, yes.
I'm sorry,
No
Lynn.
problem,
I'm
no
sorry.
problem. So in my role, I'm Assistant Director at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Assistant Director for Artificial Intelligence. In that role, I oversee all of our policy activities in AI for the White House. The most visible policy actions that we've taken to date are reflected in the President's executive order that was signed in February of this year on maintaining American leadership in AI. And that executive order laid out the American AI Initiative. Now, it's a multi-pronged initiative to help us as a nation maintain leadership in AI, but also to make sure that AI is being used to the benefit of Americans in ways that are consistent with our values. Throughout the executive order, you can find words to that effect repeatedly. It talks about privacy, civil liberties, and our values. So what does that mean? Well, the executive order is meaty. It goes into a lot of areas, such as research and development, education and workforce, issues of international engagement, technical standards development, for instance. But one of the areas that I think will be particularly of interest to this audience is the work that is required in the area of AI governance. And so one of the actions amongst the many of the executive order directs the Office of Management and Budget's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, part of OMB, directs them to create an AI memo that talks about how to approach the regulatory and non-regulatory oversight of AI. Now, what does that mean? So if you reflect back to what I said a moment ago about the fact that all AI is not the same, there are many different kinds of use cases of AI. And so we need to have some consistency in how we consider regulatory or oversight approaches to AI. To date, we have looked at areas like DOT is looking at how do you integrate driverless cars into our transportation system. FAA has looked at how do we integrate drones into our national airspace. FDA has looked at how we can market the use of AI-based tools for healthcare applications. But we could go on and on and on until all of our grandchildren are grown and still not address every use case if we're going to look at them one by one. So one of the objectives of this AI governance memo that's directed for OIRA to produce is to provide some consistency across all of the agencies and how they view the use cases of AI so that we have consistent views and approaches for how to consider the regulatory and non-regulatory use cases of AI. That's not an easy thing to do. It's not easy because really internationally we're getting at the level of not just talking about policies but actually implementing the policies. And so we're working hard to not let perfection be the enemy of the good and come up with a memo that can lead us along that way. It will reflect the United States traditional stance in recent years of a regulatory approach, which is risk-based. Meaning, again, we look at individual use cases, we consider very carefully those that might cause harm, but there are many, many, many other use cases that are not likely to cause harm to individuals, so they don't need the same kind of approach. So once this memo is drafted, we're working now on clearing an interagency draft of that. It will be released for public comment. Our anticipation is that it will come out in June. And we invite all of this audience and your colleagues to provide feedback on that high-level governance memo for AI that really sets the stage of how do we begin to implement principles like transparency. What does that mean? What do agencies do with that? And so you can look at issues of fairness, you can look at issues of safety, and you can say, well, what does that mean? What do I do with that information? And so it's the first pass, really at looking at how American policy, U.S. policy at the federal level can begin to help agencies know how to oversee these use cases. Now, the timeline for that, I mentioned June is when the draft memo will be out for public comment. And then after the feedback comes in and we work on it more, then the final version is due out in mid-August. At that point, the agencies are directed by the President in the executive order to then come up with their own agency plans for how they will oversee the use cases of AI within their regulatory authorities so that they can then help us move forward in considering what the proper use of AI is in all of these areas. Now and they have 180 days after that, so February 11th of 2020, and to craft these plans for how they will be consistent with this guidance memo that OIRA will be coming out with in August. Now, that doesn't mean that we will have regulatory solutions to every use case of AI, but we will begin a pathway forward in a way that's predictable for industry, which is very important, that people who have great ideas for how to use AI, say in healthcare, need to know that we have a consistent approach across the federal government. This will contribute to that. It'll also contribute to, hopefully, some confidence that at the federal level, we're beginning to consider holistically what these use cases are and begin to address them very specifically and tangibly. So that's a process that's underway. I want to reflect back to something that was mentioned just a moment ago about the OECD. We at the federal level, and the United States more broadly speaking, meaning the executive branch agencies, have been active in the OECD process for crafting the AI principles, which were just a couple of weeks ago signed on to by all of the OECD countries as well as 6 other non-member countries. And other non-member countries are, of course, welcome to join that as well. That's a set of principles that talks about how we, as the world, those who signed on, believe that AI should be responsibly stewarded. So what is the responsible stewardship of trustworthy AI? Those principles come into two groups. One group reflects a lot of these characteristics that we want for our AI systems. Talks about fairness and inclusion, talks about transparency and explainability, talks about safety and security, and all these kinds of characteristics that we want. It also has a section on what government should do. What's the government role? And it talks about investing in R&D to help us solve some of these tough challenges of how to build AI that has, it's trustworthy. It talks about education and workforce, how we need to engage in new programs to help our people have new skills to help us all move along in this new era of AI. It talks about the importance of an ecosystem for AI, so dealing not with just the algorithms, but also the data, cyber infrastructure. It also talks about regulatory environments, policy environments that are conducive to the responsible and trustworthy use of AI. And it also talks about international engagement and the importance of us having these kinds of conversations internationally. And so those are all principles that we very much adhere to, and we were happy to engage in that process and to sign on. And you will also see that it's very reflective of what is in our executive order, the American AI Initiative. So I think very much we're on the same page there as it relates to what those principles should be and are. The challenge now is moving to the implementation stage. And so how do we, as a nation, implement these principles? I mentioned the OIRA governance memo. More broadly speaking, one of my roles is also to oversee the implementation of the executive order, to make sure that at the interagency level, we're all working together well in order to move in the direction that we have laid out in these principles. So that's a lot of what I'm working now on in the policy area.
Thank you so much. So June, we're already at June 5th, so sometime in the next 3 weeks.
Yes, so we're working hard.
You
Yes.
should be there rather than here, probably.
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Sarah.
I want to go back to the horse bolting out of the barn. And I don't know what our Secretary General might say, but perhaps I could propose the OECD as the horse whisperer and bringing at least the horse back to the farm, if not the barn. So Lynn gave you quite a nice summary, in fact, of the OECD recommendation on artificial intelligence that was launched on the 22nd of May at our annual OECD Ministerial Council meeting. Indeed, it had the 36 member countries signing on. We also had 6 non-members signing on at the time of the launch. So we had Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Colombia, Romania, and Peru. And we have a number of other countries who have expressed interest already. So it's very exciting to see that interest growing. It's actually it's a real milestone because it is actually the first intergovernmental agreement of standards on AI that has come out. And it's a reference point for governments to set some guidelines within their national strategies and frameworks and policies to put in place to shape the environment for AI actors, so those who are deploying and operating AI. So, as Lynn said, there are 5 value-based principles incorporated in the recommendation. So you've got inclusive growth, sustainable development and well-being as the first one. You have human-centred values and fairness. You have transparency and explainability, robustness, safety and security, and then the final one is accountability. You then have 5 recommendations aimed directly at national governments. So one is about investing in R&D for AI, both at the public sector level, but also encouraging the private sector to invest. We're also talking about fostering the ecosystem. That's a lot about the infrastructure and the data that's required to actually have AI systems. Accompanying that, you have the policy environment. So really enabling AI to go from the R&D stage through to innovation and actual use cases. Building human capacity and helping labour markets adjust, because as we know, it's not easy for workers who find that their jobs are changing in sometimes quite dramatic ways. And finally, international cooperation around AI. There's 2 areas I want to stress, I think, in the context of today's discussion. One is about human rights. So the recommendation itself is very much about human values and human rights. So it talks about supporting beneficial outcomes for humans. It talks about increasing inclusiveness. It talks about augmenting people's capabilities and creativity. And it also talks about respecting human rights explicitly, having fairness, having diversity, all of those things squarely in focus. The other thing I wanted to stress is that you may be sitting there thinking, yeah, I've heard these before. This sounds familiar. There's other groups out there talking about exactly the same thing. Well, that's true, and in a way it's comforting to see everyone's moving in the same direction. What I would say is that the OECD recommendation is unique in a number of ways, and those ways actually help us to shape AI to respect human rights, in fact. So let me just point out 6 of these unique features for you. The first is that it was developed very much in a multi-stakeholder process. So we formed an expert group which had government there, but it also had industry, civil society, the technical community, trade unions and academia. So all there helping to think through what principles were the most important to try and get innovation and trust in AI. They delivered their ideas to our Committee on Digital Economy Policy, and there again we had a multi-stakeholder process where we had the governments around the table and our partners from business, trade unions, civil society and the technical community again to shape the recommendation. The second thing is it really is a political commitment. So 42 countries from different continents, different levels of development, all said, okay, I'm going to take this on as a benchmark. So it's definitely something concrete. There is significant moral force behind OECD instruments. It's what we call soft law, and you think, oh, squishy. But in fact, there's a lot of effort behind actually implementing this soft law. So the privacy guidelines, which were developed and first came out in 1980, are a good example because they actually were used as a basis of a lot of the national legislation that we see today. The instrument or the recommendation comes with a review process, and it comes with a lot of peer pressure. So there's mechanisms for us to look at how well the recommendation is being implemented in different countries. And then around the table at the OECD, you have all the governments, you have all the stakeholders there scrutinising the results. And it's a robust process. It's not always an easy ride. So you have all this pressure towards actually implementing this recommendation and making it real. It will diffuse wider, and the reason for that is that the recommendation becomes part of the OECD acquis, which means that any country that wishes to join the OECD has to say, okay, I agree that I will try and implement this recommendation. And finally, it connects to the wider work that we have. So I don't know how familiar you are with the OECD, but we pretty much cover every public policy area aside from military type issues. So we've been able to draw on our extensive work on privacy, security, infrastructure, labour markets, you name it, and we will continue to do so to be able to help implement this recommendation. So we're already underway in leveraging it. We're preparing practical guidance. We're going to be launching an OECD AI Policy Observatory later this year. We have a book coming out next week, as the moderator mentioned. So we're very excited to be really pushing this issue along. Thanks.
Thank you. Biljana, policy.
Great. So I thought that Lynn spoke about the national level, the federal level here in the US. And also Sarah talked about the international level in terms of how these frameworks develop on these two different levels. And what I could do is perhaps complement that with a bit of an insight about another layer, a regional layer, that is the European Union's effort. And of course, I'm an academic, so I'm not a representative of a European institution. I can myself be critical about some of these processes, but I think there's also a lot of added value. So I'm going to just lay out the basic framework. And then I'm going to say a couple of words, just a couple of words about the subnational level, and that connects a little bit to the project on cities that I've started. So here in the US, again, the subnational level and how some of these issues are tackled there. So the European Union's framework starts off with the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a binding document, but there's also an effort to complement that with ethics guidelines, another soft law document. And just a month before the OECD guidelines were published, the European Union came up with its own ethics guidelines on AI, on trustworthy AI. And if one reads through the guidelines, what comes across is that they're called the trustworthy AI, but what really comes across is that there's an attempt to have this kind of human-centered AI. So there are four main principles around which the guidelines revolve. The first one is autonomy, and that connects to human oversight. Then we have the prevention of harm, and that goes to building in safety within AI systems, and also trying to prevent power asymmetries. The other principle, overarching principle, is fairness, and that goes to non-discrimination, but also the protection of vulnerable communities, minorities such as disabled people, in certain cases, women, etc. And then the other kind of effort, also the European Union's framework, is to have a horizontal approach at the first instance. So this is not sector specific. It is across fields. It covers both public and private bodies. And it also dovetails on the GDPR's approach, which means that it extends not only to AI, which is produced in the European Union, but also to AI, which is deployed in the EU. The last principle that is explainability, and we see here, of course, a lot of overlap also between the approaches that are undertaken. Explainability goes to due process, so it's also very much based on human rights. We'll see how this is going to be implemented, as Sarah was saying, afterwards in different sectors, and how is it going to interact, of course, with the already existing legal framework. Now, when we go to the subnational level here in the United States, we see also a bit of an effort from cities to regulate some of these issues as technology enrolls primarily in big cities. And just a couple of weeks ago, San Francisco is worth mentioning. They came up with a binding citywide ordinance, which suggests this kind of process-based control over the rollout of new technologies. So there's a lot of emphasis on audits, on periodic audits, as well as public input and public consultation, so that the relevant stakeholders are also consulted in the process, and there is a feedback loop with the public. So as we see the rollout of AI in different spaces, we can also expect that cities are perhaps in certain occasions going to push back in sort of ways that control the rollout of AI and have this kind of broader discussion and public input into regulatory, soft regulatory, and also binding regulatory measures.
Thank you. Lorraine.
Okay, so I'll try to focus on elements that have not been discussed so far, because I think the panel has done a wonderful job talking about the sociological as well as the national, international, and regional elements of policy development. I spent a lot of time in the last few years focusing on ethics. I had a research project in which we tried to develop better programs for engineers to have better ethical reasoning capabilities when they were designing or doing research. And of course, I worked with ACM on recrafting their code of ethics. And then in my work with EPIC last fall, worked with developing these universal guidelines for AI. But what I want to speak about a little bit more specifically for those who don't read as much and think as much about ethics and human rights is talk about them a little bit more specifically and why we have found them helpful in terms of all levels of policy development that we're doing. So first, just as a point of clarification, when we talk about ethics, we oftentimes think in terms of virtue. Something's good or something bad. That is a binary state. An individual is good or bad, ethical or not. But rather, I think it's much more helpful to think about ethics in terms of behaviors and practices that have moral consequences or processes of considering the ethical issues and then and the stakeholder to determine what the best course of action is in a specific context. So in the context of AI, what that means is designing, developing, implementing, regulating AI systems and technologies that yield actions that would be considered ethical practice if they were performed by human beings. So I'm going to mention a few basic ethical issues that often come up but are not so explicitly named that assist in this deliberation of whether or not something that we are developing is ethical practice. So one of them has to do with beneficence. We don't talk as much about AI that's good, AI for good. And I mentioned that in my opening remarks, that there are many instances and examples of AIs, whether they're tools or relational support and these kinds of things, that are good. So beneficence is something that we oftentimes look and consider in contrast with non-maleficence. And that is an ethical question of, is what I am doing or what I'm designing going to cause harm? So we hear a lot about this in the medical community, that the practice that you have should not do harm to the patient in the process of trying to do good. The other two ethical issues that we constantly think about have to do with justice. And of course, when we're talking about algorithmic bias, it goes into this basic ethical principle that what we are doing is fair. It's fair in consideration with others in the world. So it's really a societal level approach to thinking about, is this ethical not only for the individual patient with a particular set of issues that we need to resolve, but rather what are the consequences for those who may also be using it under different contexts. And then the last is autonomy, which is something that I mentioned before, in that we have systems that are designed to respect human agency or their agency in the decisions that affect their lives. It's important to recognize that these are not singular issues. We can't make a determination that an AI system is fair, therefore it's ethical, and we're done with that. In fact, there are multiple elements that need to be considered, and oftentimes they are in conflict with one another, and they create ethical dilemmas. Which do I choose? A system that's fair, or do I choose a system that does no harm? So for example, 3 quick examples. Innovation in breast imaging technologies that I mentioned earlier can save thousands of lives in early detection, but accurate prediction and development of those sophisticated imaging technologies requires gathering a lot of data. And gathering a lot of data creates privacy and security risk for the people whose data is being used. The second example is autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. We know the research shows that they reduce traffic fatalities that are due to human error. But they're designed with algorithms that still don't match human intelligence in unpredictable, unusual circumstances, such as a pedestrian who's standing next to a tree or a stop sign who cannot be easily detected. Another example, and I think somebody already mentioned this or alluded to this, is in terms of predictive algorithms, predictive statistics about who's likely to recommit a crime. And it gives good support in judicial decision making. But the algorithms create these false premises. They're based upon data that already has bias in there. And the consequence is a loss of freedom in months and years and so forth. So the next question then is, what is the relationship between ethics and human rights? Why are we talking about human rights in this abstract, somewhat ambiguous context? And I think it's really important to consider this broader set of human rights, because technologies and AI and technologies are no longer impacting a narrow segment of our lives. It's not just about the financial systems and how the bank handles my money. It's not just about the privacy of my educational records and who has access to that. But instead, and particularly with AI technologies, these impact our whole lives, all broad experiences, relationships, finances, education, employment opportunities. And so the potential to violate multiple human rights is large because of the scope and scale of these technologies. They also play out, AI technologies plays out, or all technologies play out on a global scale now. And so it requires international deliberation, such as what OECD has been doing. So historically, we have in place an international agreement through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was passed after World War II. And that is an agreement that can serve as a good foundation for continuing our assessment of whether or not the design of our technologies or the policies that we're developing are appropriately considering, again, what I mentioned at the beginning, really imagining risk that we haven't yet considered, that we don't yet know. So the Universal Declaration includes 30 rights. I'm not going to enumerate them, but for example, dignity of the individual, liberty, when we talk about judicial decision-making about who is going to be sentenced for a longer period of time, equality. The human rights also include the rights of the individual in the community, and that includes freedom of movement around the community, around the nation, around the globe, freedom of privacy, and freedom from state interference. And I mentioned this specifically, it's encoded in there, it's agreed upon internationally. And it also includes the human rights or expectations of an individual's economic, social, and cultural rights. And that is, for example, the right of a standard of living that is adequate for the health and well-being of the individual and their families. So these human rights become very salient in our discussion and our evaluation of whether AI systems are ethical, and also salient in our discussion of the development of policy and law that will help to ensure and regulate that we adhere to this basic understanding that we have been using for decades now, and avoid the potential for violating these basic human rights. I do want to mention one example, rather than spend time talking about some of the frameworks. The framework that we developed through the Universal Guidelines for AI through the Public Voice as a coalition of civil society organizations shares a lot with what OECD has done, and that's because they are among the participants who have helped to develop this. And so those have already been discussed, but I do want to also mention when we talk about ethical dilemmas and difficulties, these are not always easy to tackle. And oftentimes these dilemmas are difficult to resolve. And I'm going to use one example. There has been a study that has been conducted at MIT called the Moral Machines. And what they have been doing is gathering data across multiple countries around the world to assess this situation. I'm driving a car. There's a potential for a crash coming up, and I may hit somebody who's crossing the street. I have children in the back seat, and if I swerve, that might put them at risk. So that's a standard trolley problem that we constantly talk about in ethics. But what they have done is try to determine how people around the world value these decisions depending upon who's crossing the street. Is that a man or a woman crossing the street? Is that an older person or a younger person crossing the street? Is that a black person or a white person? Is that someone with religious garb that tells me what their religion is? And based upon those values, what would be your decision? Would you swerve, save your children? Would you hit the pedestrian? What you would do? Now, the reason that they are doing this study is to try to understand how do we design systems that reflect the values of cultures around the world. But what do we do with that information when we find out that people are more likely to hit women in the crosswalk than they are to hit men? When they're more likely to hit black people than they are to hit white people? More likely to hit someone with religious garb that's not similar to theirs? What do we do with this? Do we encode that because it reflects the current values of our global society, and we know that it's right in that particular culture? Or do we try to do something that we think is more ethical? I don't have an answer for this, but it's important to be thinking about how do we handle these dilemmas, and how do we approach that as designers of systems as well as individuals who are involved in the policy and the regulation of assessing whether or not a system is ethical.
Thank.
You want to be thin if you don't want to be hit.
You want to be thin.
You want to be thin.
Thin. Okay. So thin is even more important than not wearing religious garb. Okay. Okay. We've got about 20 minutes, 20 minutes for crosstalk with the panel, and then I want to leave some time to open it up to the audience. I could ask 7 questions. I've got them all written down, but I want to give you the opportunity to talk to each other first. So,
I have a question.
yes, go right ahead.
I had a question of whether in the White House instructions and the OECD instructions and your ethic things, there's any talk about guidelines or safeguards for the kinds of relationships people form with the inanimate. Because, for example, I have an interview with one of the CEOs who produced an artificial intelligence that was designed for very young children. And one of the things he says they form, on the basis of their studies, they form very intense relationships with this toy. We just hope they're the right kind of relationships. And he didn't know what the right kind of relationships. We had no idea what that would be. But it was clear that the children bonded intensely with these objects, but he just was hoping that whatever these relationships would be, they would be good ones, showing that we're just kind of moving out into the unknown. But I'm not sure if that would even qualify as an AI in your, categorization.
Yeah, the principles don't really get into that issue, neither the OECD nor what we're implementing at the White House level.
I think we're going to form relationships with these AIs. I think you should include this is going to be one of the issues. We're going to be very enmeshed with these things.
I think this is a great point, because also in the kind of the European guidelines, it appears that one of the examples is for beneficial uses of AI is how AI can actually help autistic children. And so this whole dimension that you're bringing is something that's not discussed, so it's basically taken for granted that certain AI can help in that context. So that's a great point.
I interview people who come home and talk to Alexa. Treat it as a help, as their person. So I think that you're not, that we need to, whether or not something is designed to be an artificial intimacy, AI becomes an artificial intimacy. And I think that by not somehow acknowledging that, and not acknowledging that those relationships are going to change who we are as people, and particularly for children as they grow up, who they become as people. What having a relationship with an artificial intimacy does to a child. I think that should somehow be, added to the mix.
I do think
if it's not in the mix.
I do think this point about the human in the loop that you brought up and Lorraine brought up just as well is an important point that we do need to consider just broadly for AI. And one of the use cases that's been mentioned here is the use of facial recognition in law enforcement. And I think that's a really good example to try to dig into what is our real concern. And if you talk with people about the concerns about the use of AI, facial recognition in law enforcement, a lot of times the conversation begins with a statement, well, the AI can be biased because it's based on data that represents something that's not appropriate to the context, and that's all true, it can be true, although we're learning more how to deal with that, and there are now new tools that can help us mitigate that. But when you dig into it, if you ask a question and say, okay, let's presume that the AI system is 100% accurate, you can guarantee it, just for purposes of discussion, you can guarantee that it's 100% accurate. And the police are only using it when they stop someone for a traffic violation to detect someone who has a warrant out for their arrest. And that is the only use case. So me, as a technologist, you would say, okay, it's not an AI question anymore then. So that's not about an AI not doing what you want the AI to do. Often in these conversations, people will still say, I don't want the AI to be there. And when you dig into it, the real question is a human question. It's a human question of not trusting law enforcement, and therefore perhaps they trust the AI system incredibly much, and they think the AI system will do exactly what it's supposed to do, and therefore somehow it will help law enforcement be more powerful when in fact they think law enforcement is already too powerful. So I think it's important in these conversations when you talk about the human in the loop, the element of the human working with technology to really help us hone in on exactly what it is that we're concerned about. And it's not just about the human as well, it's also about just technology in general. I think AI has sometimes become a proxy for technology, and a lot of our concerns about technology are then said, well, it's an AI problem. But often it's not an AI problem, it's a human problem, humans using technology in a way that maybe AI assists, but typically it's just a human and technology challenge. So I do think it helps us when we're thinking about how to address these from a policy perspective, that we try to dig in and be very precise of exactly what the concern is, so that then we can begin to address it from a policy perspective and not just treat AI as the bad actor in this, when it's often the issue is not really with the AI.
So,
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question about whether it is AI or just technology in general, and this is just the latest in a wave of technologies where people worry about their kids and the relationship that they have with the particular technology. So we at the OECD have, in fact, another recommendation on the protection of children online, and it's being reviewed right now. And in a survey that we did out to countries and stakeholders saying, well, what's concerning you right now? It was things like cyberbullying, things like sexting, that seem to be coming up in people's minds the most about what is the risk to children right now, and also the different devices that they now have and the uses they can make of them. So I'd be interested in your views. Is AI just the latest in a wave of technologies where we think, oh, I'm not sure about all the kids in front of the telly, and we've gone from the telly now to the mobile phone, and perhaps now to AI devices?
No, I think we just haven't seen. I think that I'm like 2 steps ahead because I'm privileged to be at MIT, where I actually have robots to study with kids. So I'm kind of in your future. Hello, people. My only privilege is I get to play with children and robots, and tell you from the future, children form intense relationships with these robots if you're thinking about AI, start to think about the relationships children are going to form with them, because it's going to be significant for these children's development. And while you're writing your guidelines, consider those relationships in that educational, relational, human, just put a line in there so that it's included in your infrastructure, because we don't think about that. Like when we considered phones, we didn't think, oh, I wonder what the phones will do to our relationships with each other. I wonder if we'll look each other in the eye once we have our phones.
Right.
That was like, who wondered about whether or not
People would look at each other.
we would look at each other. We just wanted our phones because, we...
I have to correct, nobody's taken out their phone, so the entire panel. This is really good.
See what I'm saying? But if somebody in the future would have called back and say, look, just, tap you on the shoulder and say, it's not just that we'll be talking to each other. We may not be looking at each other. Think about that. You'd have like another area of study. So I think that's what I'm trying to say, that the influence of AI is also the artificial intimacy it offers us.
Let me ask a question on another topic that was stimulated by the San Francisco example, which I find so riveting. So with all of these policy expertise up here, how are we going to reconcile? Forget about OECD and the EU and all of the international stuff, but just in the United States of America, what are we going? How we have a driving code that more or less is consistent across the country. In some places you can turn right on red, and some places you can't turn right on. You're supposed to know when you cross into a state something about the variations. But the idea that there are going to be these kinds of technology regulations that are going to be city by city is going to be different in San Francisco than in Austin, Texas, than in Louisville, Kentucky. And then there are state regulations on top of those and federal regulations on top of those. How on earth is American society going to reconcile that's the view, the San Francisco law is the view from the future that I'm interested in today.
That is a great question, and I hope I can have the answer once I've written the book. It will be in a couple of years' time. But let me begin by saying that this is, of course, a federalism question and also a localism question. So to what extent do you want to that states and cities have autonomy? And there's, of course, the federal constitution. There's also the state constitutions. So there is a certain level of autonomy there that is constitutionally embedded. And also there's the city charters, so also autonomy is given to cities in most cases under home rule. So there are the legal, that is the legal backdrop, I guess. Is this going to end up in some sort of anarchy in which we have these kind of very different rules not be able to coexist? Or are we going to see citizens vote with their feet and basically choose on the basis of the bundle of services that they're given? I mean, this remains to be seen. I think there's something kind of normatively positive in the sort of democratic kind of buzz that is coming from these kind of units that are on the subnational level. But at the same time, you can see also that a lot of these policies are sort of, in Justice Brandeis' words, sort of laboratories of democracy.
Yeah.
So they serve as also being canvassed afterwards for being canvassed on the state or on the federal level. So there is a continuous interaction between the city, state, and federal level.
So yeah, my worry would be, it's to some extent, I would be worried about anarchy, but anarchy is not always a terrible thing. But whether the broad principles that have been discussed are interpreted so differently locally that they lose all substantive meaning. That's kind of the greater worry. Well, here in Topeka, this is, we think fairness and justice and whatever, we interpret this use of the technology as serving our priorities among these values that you know, we all agree on, but we also agree they're always all in tension with each other. So,
Absolutely,
yeah.
Isn't what California trying politically to show is that you can do this and still not have rises in crime rates, still not have, still have.
I don't know what they're trying to
Well,
do.
no,
but
I
okay.
I would put forth that that's
Okay.
what the experiment is trying to show, that you can do this and have a polity that's well functioning, and then say, look, we've controlled, we've made a statement about civil society and non-surveillance and democracy, and we're living together. We offer this to you to the country, to the world, as a successful experiment.
Okay, well, we'll
I'm
see.
I'm really quite optimistic.
Okay, good. Maybe we should stop talking now.
I just think there is always this tension between the rights of local, local organizations, cities, and so forth, or states to have their view. I mean, certainly we've acknowledged that the cultural differences are real, and so the benefits in some regions might be higher than the negatives. I mean, it's hard to say, and I think that's why it's often helpful to have the ability to, you hate to say you're experimenting with people, right? But we are experimenting with policy.
Yeah.
And so it's a question, I think one area that could be very beneficial is to help gather evidence as these things are tried out by different regions, to help share best practices and lessons learned, so that we can make these kinds of policy decisions based on evidence. Not based on fear. I think fear is often the driver, and a lack of understanding of what the technology really does. So I think the important thing, both internationally and then with the states, is to make sure that we are sharing what we learned from these. They are policy experiments, to see whether it makes sense. And I could imagine that if something consistently, the same practice seems to be consistently and agreeably the same everywhere, a best practice, and I suppose you could imagine happening at the federal level. But I do think it's relatively early still. You do need the ability to try things out, and I think because there are a lot of dilemmas, we can't necessarily say this is clearly the right answer. So I think we're still early enough in this policy approach.
Anything anyone else would like to speak to each other about before we go to the audience? Any other points anybody wants to pick up on? No? We ready to see if the audience wants to talk? We can always go back and talk to each other if something else comes up. Does anyone in the audience have a question they would like to pose to any of the panelists? I see hands up over here, and there's a hand up over here.
Hey, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the American University here in Washington. I also served as the Associate Director of the Office of Presidential Correspondence at the White House in 2011. And what we've been seeing is a growing concern amongst the baby boomer generation, whether you went to college or not, and now you have college-age children, and you've worked your entire life, like at a factory or some office, and you've gained your pension or your retirement, you see your 401k fleeting, and you've put all of your investment and hope in your children to be able to support you, to be able to have their own children and function as adults. But what you're seeing is that now that your children are in college and they're not aware that, they may be taking advice from a classmate on, whether to take one internship over another internship. Or a classmate may plant a seed or a thought of, maybe, you look better with long hair or short hair. Just those kinds of simple suggestions from an artificially intelligent being, a humanoid clone, and you're not aware of that. And all of your hopes are riding on your own children being able to disseminate, how to make those decisions so your family doesn't crumble. How would you speak to parents?
I just wanted to, let me back up. There was something I should have said. So I'd like you to bring your comment to a question with a question mark at the end, if you could, please.
My bad. I got it. So the question is, if you were having a conversation with a parent who's, say, 45 years old with children in college about how to talk to their children about maintaining their family livelihood, what would you say?
question to Sherry.
Is this a question for Sherry?
I think so.
Is the premise of your question that the children are having conversations with humanoid clones?
In college classrooms, absolutely.
I was saying that I don't think they're having conversations with humanoid clones yet.
Okay. Next, there was a question over here.
I'm willing to go out on a limb there.
No, just to have the mic there. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Stephanie Rosenbaum. I run a user experience consultancy where we design and do research in user interfaces on all kinds of things, including some that are relating to what you're talking about here. And my question goes back to the past and forward to the future, based on what Sherry was saying about the close emotional ties to the robot. If you look back at children's literature 100 years ago, you see a lot of people worrying about the close ties children were having to their teddy bears, right? And if you look at science fiction, some science fiction that's being written today, you read about mechanical intelligences protesting against the prejudice against either mechanical or flesh-based intelligences. They're equivalent, but there's still some prejudice against them. So I guess the question is,
What's the difference?
yeah,
Oh, I have a very,
please.
well, I've written at length about this, and here's just the simplest way I can say this, is that when you talk, because I've done the differential studies between relationships to teddy bears and relationships to robotic teddy bears. In a relationship to a Barbie, a young girl projects her guilt, her fantasies, her fears. So if she has just broken her mother's crystal, she will put her Barbies in detention because she projects her concerns on the Barbies. If she's in relationship to an artificial intimacy, the artificial intimacy says to her, so you've just broken your mother's crystal. You feel bad about that, don't you? In other words, the artificial intimacy is engaging her really in a relationship where the artificial intimacy is taking the role of a human being.
Eliza did that 40 years ago.
But Eliza didn't know anything. I mean, that was the difference, is that Eliza didn't know anything. And these objects, I give them full credits, they actually know a lot. So it's the difference between a relationship of projection, which actually is quite healthy for a child, because a child can then examine what's on their mind by looking at the relationship, and a relationship with a new kind of entity that doesn't have empathy, it isn't kind of a real relationship, but it's a credible enough relationship that you feel as though you are in a relationship with another person. So the psychology is of engagement rather than projection. It's a completely different kind of relationship, and I'm just saying to those of us who care about the future of these objects, let's include this new kind of relationship that we are going to be in. I mean, the soldiers in Iraq formed relationships with their artificially intelligent robots that prevented them from walking into places that had mines, and formed connections with them. Those were important to study, those connections. Let's anticipate the reality of these new relationships, and let's figure out, it isn't going to be a question of controlling them, but what kinds of, what's good for our kids and where actually we shouldn't be giving them to these kids. Because just to have a CEO saying, my God, these relationships are intense, I hope kids form the right kind of relationships with these it's like, I don't want to be interviewing this. This is not, I'm not in my happy place,
We want the kid to buy the next model. Right,
the next model would be better, yeah,
Yes.
right. The next model would be better.
Right here in the second row. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, there's one over here.
I have a question for actually mostly OECD, the White House, and Sherry. I'm originally from Chicago. if you guys know anything about the pre-crime predictive abilities that Chicago is now doing. In a lot of ways, they're predicting criminals, but they're making those criminals criminals now. So you're sort of saying, oh, he's going to be a criminal, and now we're going to make him a criminal to prove our algorithm's right. So MIT actually did some of those algorithms, the black box algorithms. What are you doing to change the culture of MIT? And from OECD, what are you doing to have the victims part of your panels?
I'll start with me. I feel as though I am, the word that came to me was at war, but that puts it too strongly. I feel in conflict with the culture of MIT, and I feel as though I try. I mean, I think I was polite here. But I try to challenge some of the basic assumptions of how technology is used unproblematically, and not just at MIT, but in the engineering culture in general. This notion of friction-free that I presented here today, I mean, if you really think about it, the idea that the world should be as friction-free as possible in every aspect of its working is so core to the engineering mentality and is so core in the way it was picked up by the political system and is so dangerous to our democracy. And is so central to Facebook, and that has been, that's been my sort of job description, challenging that, for decades. So, I mean, I know saying I teach and write to challenge it doesn't sound like exactly like I'm on the barricades, but it's the best I can do.
Lorraine?
I'll make a quick comment before Sarah jumps in on here. At least at the national level, in National Science Foundation, for example, has made a concerted effort in the last 5 years to increase the amount of funding, to increase programs that will develop ethics across the curriculum. Ethics specifically in computer science curriculum, ethics in data science curriculum. In fact, that was part of a project that I was funded under for about 4 years. And I'm attending a workshop just next week that talks about integrated ethics. So there's a large movement, at least in the United States, to recognize that whether it's ethics, whether it's requiring more sociology courses or something like that, to broaden the perspectives of engineers and computer scientists that are responsible for the design and development of the technologies we're talking about.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the users need to be involved in the conversation. So, I mean, one thing that one of the people involved in the development of our recommendations said is that there's a lot of AI stakeholders out there, not so many of the AI kind of actors in charge, and we need to ensure that the stakeholders are fully engaged. And in terms of the victims, as you call them, I guess what our recommendation does is to set out some of these broad principles like human-centred values, like calling on governments to try and establish bias-free data sets, trying to establish transparency and explainability in algorithms and in the way AI systems run. But those kind of questions have to come at the more granular level, and this is what Lynn was talking about as well in terms of the actual use cases. So we need to think about, what are the ethics that we use when we're running scientific experiments? What are the ethics and other kind of principles that we should think about? For example, yes, in the justice system and so on. So I think you need to have that more granular discussion, and indeed that is when you need to have everyone around the table.
And just I want to add up to that I absolutely agree, and that I think that also what Lynn was saying, that this granularity will come also with the different types of perhaps also responsibilities that different algorithmic system will have. In the justice system, you have one set of issues, will be perhaps a very different
sort of set of issues if you have an algorithm that is not able to predict your shopping habits. So this granularity is indeed essential as we go forward.
I think, sorry, I was going to say, I think that comes out too in the EC guidelines, ethics guidelines, that we're the third section is about the kind of questions that you should ask yourself as an AI actor. Have I done X, Y, and Z? You know, at that more granular level. Sorry.
I think, well, I just wanted to add, I think there's also an educational component to this, which is that it's not just about the ethics of the people designing the tool, but it's also about just the educational understanding of what an AI system can and can't do for those who are acquiring tools. Because those who are acquiring these tools to do whatever, such as predictive policing, are not going to be the AI experts. It could be that if they had a better understanding, more of a kind of a computational thinking mindset that says, okay, these are the ways that a black box might go wrong. You don't have to understand it deeply to understand at some level these are the ways it might not be a very good idea. That's really important, broadly speaking. So I think there's an educational perspective for all of us to learn more about, even at a high level, what these AI tools can and can't do.
Yeah, and just I think I offer a little hope. I mean, I was just sitting. I took it on the airplane coming here. Somebody said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm giving a lecture on privacy." And he says, "Is it true that Alexa keeps notes on you?" And I said, "Yeah, you could say that kind of keeps notes on you." He says, "Why?" And I said, "Well, I think it's because Amazon thinks they can make money on it. I mean, I think at the root of it is," I said, "I don't think that's right." I don't know who this person was. But the point is, right now, before your guidelines are out, that's okay. I mean, there's we have no basis to say that they shouldn't keep notes on you or tell you when it's on or tell you when it's off.
It's also a good...
So where's the mic? We got to move on to the next question.
Well, I mean, but that's the point.
But it's also a good example of the tension in that the Alexa is keeping information about you in order to provide a better service for you down the road. It's learning a little bit more about you. That's the trade-off between
It
a
can
privacy.
tell me.
That's true. It could tell you.
It could tell me. It's not keeping notes.
Yes, it could.
Okay.
Thank you. Christine Borgman, Information Studies, UCLA professor. I want to take us back to the intersection of privacy and AI policy, and specifically the changing nature of interpretation of the traditional OECD guidelines and fair information practice and so on. Universities, especially in the US, are collecting massive amounts of data about their students. We know what they eat, we know their grades, we know when they use course management systems, we know when they sleep, we know when they use social media, and we're building models of students to guide them to time to degree, to what, to what their social activities, to their what courses they should be in, where they should stay in Harry's class, and so on and so forth. What kind of guidance do you have to offer both to universities, because notice and consent is not enough here, it's really about uses, and advice to students, individuals, on how to govern their data of what they release to their universities, which are supposed to be their trusted bodies?
God forbid that they should have a recommendation system on whether to stay at Harvard weighted by the amount of money that the dropouts have made relative to the ones who graduated.
So I come from an academic background. I'm a professor of computer science and was interim dean of engineering. So I know from the academic perspective, those kinds of data analysis activities can actually be helpful in the aggregate of understanding things like these are the courses where students are more likely to fail and therefore more likely to drop out. That data can now target some interventions for the class as a whole in an area that can help students be more likely to succeed, because we know that is a common place where students end up failing out, and actually dropping out of school altogether. So in the aggregate, that kind of data analysis can be very helpful for making students more successful. It gets much more tricky if you're talking about individual students, and I think until the technology is better, we don't necessarily want to look at this at the individual student level, but I do think in the aggregate of understanding how the curricula is helping students be successful is a good way to use some of that data.
Other comments on that one?
No, I guess the OECD guidelines don't get to the level of whether it's about a university or other data collective. I mean, what we've found in general is that the flows of data, the use of data, the value of data, and the different business models that you have is really changing the nature of privacy. And so, thinking more about accountability, thinking more about data quality and the way in which we handle data is a huge question. But I think Lynn's right that you need to balance both the costs and benefits of it. And I was just thinking to myself, actually, I imagine you see some horrifying patterns in that data sometimes if you care to look at the university students. So,
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. There's, I see a hand up over here.
Thank you. Stephanie Perrin, Ottawa, Canada. I'm just wondering, I can well imagine lawsuits for damages and harm in the United States. What do you propose or have you thought about as repercussions for companies that try out their technology in, let's say, failed states and it leads to massive harm? I'm thinking of biometrics, algorithms to detect criminality, or opposite political views, that kind of thing. I can see we have a vacuum there.
I think
Here's a jurisdiction question.
I think it's something interesting just happened now. I'm not sure it's going to lead to a lawsuit, but I'm forgetting the name of the experiment. But Facebook just did. So somebody give me the name of the experiment. They just did a massive experiment on preschool, on an online preschool education. Excuse me? No, it was called something else. And anyway, they massively rolled it out in a state. They signed up every kid who had Facebook, and it was a preschool. It was called Friction or something, Fiction or Fusion. I think it was called Fusion, and it was to great fanfare, and everybody was signed up, and they took out the preschools in the state basically, and sold this, and then the parents sort of sued. I mean, the parents said, no, this is horrible. Our kids are not learning anything. They're sitting all day in front of the computer. We want our preschools back. And it was really interesting because it happened. Do you know the story?
Yeah, I was going to go in a slightly different direction. I think one of the real challenges that we have is that authoritarian governments are exporting these mass surveillance technologies, and they're exporting them to countries where you have wannabe authoritarians that now are getting better control of their country. Sadly, because those states are often failed states, the people don't have a legal system where they can speak up and do anything about it. So I think that is an important international challenge that we need to collectively figure out how to address.
I'd say one activity that we already have is our work on responsible business conduct at the OECD. So multinational enterprises, or the countries that have adhered to the recommendation, are meant to implement human rights or respect human rights in whatever country they're operating in, regardless of whether the government in that country actually has the same level of respect for human rights. So I think that is one way through to the question that you were asking.
So the siren outdoors must mean that I'm supposed to call the panel to a close. So I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank Russ Holt for his generous introduction to the panel. I want to thank the 5 panelists. It was a great discussion. I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to urge you all to support EPIC's work. Thank you.